Welcome to World War II, Part 27. This is the Eastern Front, Part 3, where I left off during the Battle of Stalingrad, a battle which some people contest was a changing point in World War II, but clearly in the Eastern Front it was indeed one of the major turning points of the war. Now, I've covered the earlier spectacular failure of the planned Russian attack towards Kharkov and the great tactics of Erich von Manstein that not only destroyed that attack by luring them to edge of the supplies before launching a rapid counterattack, that tore holes in the German lines, allowing Case Blue, the German summer offensive, to get off to a flying start, after overcoming the earlier Russian offensive, leaving large holes in the lines, and the German advance into the Caucasus and through from the Donetsk Basin into the Great Bend of the Don towards Stalingrad and the initial battle for the city. Now, like I pointed out, the battle for the city was intensely fierce, and the Russians, with only two partial armies, the 64th and the 62nd Army in Stalingrad, held out bitterly for every yard of ground, and I've kind of started to cover that. From the story I mentioned, from the Russian communications officer putting live wires in his mouth, electrocuting himself but re-establishing communication, to howling dogs jumping into the Volga to swim away from the explosions and the cries and the screams and the blasts and the sounds of the screaming Stuka dive bombers, just a horrendous hellhole. And I think it was summed up really by Vasily Zaitsev, the great Russian sniper, featured in the film Enemy at the Gates, which is about a sniper in the Battle of Stalingrad. He came up with the coin phrase, "For us there is no land beyond the Volga." Stalingrad was embedded against the Volga River, and Vasily Zaitsev basically said, "There is no land for us beyond here." Basically meaning we fight and die here to the death. And the Russians, pretty much with Stalin's order that no more ground was to be given up, every inch of ground was to be fought for and defended. Stalingrad held on, even though at times they were literally pushed to within a few hundred yards of the riverbank in areas. The Germans overcame 85% at city, maybe 10% at city left, and like I said, some of the pockets were like a few hundred yards away from the Volga itself, but the Russians held on. The German air attack that had bombarded Stalingrad and basically turned it into huge piles of rubble, had left devastated buildings, piles of stone and rock everywhere, basically created a terrain, that the Russian snipers and the Russian infantrymen, fiercely motivated to never lose that city, could fight. You could get a pile of stones with a slight hole underneath inside a Russian sniper, the barrel of the gun pointing out, sniping at Germans. The German tanks, which were fantastic on the open battlefield, on the Russian steppes and the Russian plains, were very, very ineffective in Stalingrad for the most part. A lot of the time, they couldn't use the full range of the weapons. A lot of the times they were crammed in narrow streets where they were basically at liberty of being attacked by the Russians. And the battle was ferocious, The Germans had pushed them back. The Russians would, fill barges of troops from the other side of the Volga, sail them across the Volga into Stalingrad, often under heavy air attack and from, facing sniper fire and artillery fire. They'd literally get off on the banks of the Volga at Stalingrad and literally run up the bank straight into fighting to reinforce areas or to counter-attack in other areas. It was a ferocious battle. Now, one Russian officer left this excerpt to give you an idea of the ferociousness of fighting. 0730 hours, the enemy has reached Academy Street. This is in Stalingrad itself. 10 minutes later, the 1st Battalion 38th Mechanized Brigade is cut off from our main force, so the Germans managed to cut one Russian units off. Then 10 minutes later, the station is in enemy hands. So the station they are fighting to defend has been captured by the Germans. 40 minutes later, the Russians managed to retake the station. Then, an hour later, the Germans retake the station for the second time in under 2 hours. That gives you an idea of a station. The Germans are fighting for it to clear it. They manage to take it. The Russians re-infiltrate and push back, force the Germans out, retake the station, and then the Germans have to counterattack and clear the station out again. That happens, 3 times in only 2 hours. Now at 10:40 that same morning, the enemy has reached Pushkin Street, 500 yards only from the army's battle headquarters. Then 20 minutes later, 2 regiments of infantry and supported by 30 tanks are moving towards the technical institution in Stalingrad. This shows the fierceness of the fighting, how every building, every street became a battleground. Now, on September 14th, there were only 50,000 men left fighting in the 62nd Army. However, on September 14th, a regiment at 13th Guards Division, like I said, was sent hurriedly across Volga in reinforcements, and that allowed General Chuikov to retake Kurgan Hill. Then 3 days later, more men, an infantry brigade and an armoured brigade also crossed the Volga on ferries to take part in defence of Stalingrad. However, this did not really slow the Germans down. The Germans heavily outnumbered the Russians. The Russians were relying on stealth and the terrain to enable them to defend the city. So slightly downstream at Station, the Germans finally occupied, the hill they were fighting for. This cut off the 62nd Army on its left from the 64th Army and trapped it against the river in a front of some 15 miles. So basically, even though the Germans had a massive numerical advantage, General Chuikov gave a clear indication of the success. He said it did not depend on strength, but on ability, skill, daring, and guile. General Chuikov said buildings split up enemy formations like breakwaters, forcing them to follow the line of the streets. This is why we clung to the most solid ones, with small units capable of all-round defence. These buildings allowed us to set up centres of resistance from which defenders mowed down the Nazis with their automatic weapons. Now, it must be recalled that the Russians had followed more closely than the Germans the fighting between Spanish nationalists and Republicans in December 1936 in the outer suburbs in Madrid, in Spanish Civil War. Now, experience had shown that large modern concrete buildings were all but proof against medium artillery fire, and there were many such buildings in Stalingrad, especially large factory buildings, of which Marshal Chuikov said there was such solid construction in metal and concrete, and development of their underground installations allowed prolonged and bitter resistance. So basically, these factory buildings, part of the heavy industrial area of Stalingrad, were just perfect buildings to absorb punishment and stay standing. And with their underground bases, men could stay quite safe. They could defend the buildings up top. It really, really was a nightmare for Germans to clear the city. Now, von Paulus called on General von Richthofen, commander of Luftwaffe 4, we all know General von Richthofen, of course, to make up for lack of artillery by bombarding the city even further. But this only effect, from this massive aerial bombardment was to create enormous piles of rubble in the streets, which prevented use of armour. The German tanks could not manoeuvre. Many streets were barricaded by rubble from attacked and destroyed buildings. So really the Germans were up against it. Now, German engineers at the time had no bulldozers to clear such rubble away under enemy fire. So basically, once the rubble was there, the German engineers could do very little about it. Now, this was a lesson of experience, but basically Western Allies made the same mistakes at both Mount Cassino and Normandy. Now, German tanks themselves were split into units of 15 to 20 tanks only, but these were prevented, like I said, from using range of their guns in streets, whereas the Russians, in attic windows, cellars, manholes, were able to attack them, often at a range of just a few meters, were Molotov cocktails, which are like petrol bombs, anti-tank grenades, and the 14.5mm anti-tank rifles, which were no good in open country, but in this close static street fighting actually could be quite effective. So German infantry, moreover, no better off than its comrades in the panzers. Now, General Chuikov also wrote in his diaries, the defenders of Stalingrad let the tanks come within range of their guns and anti-tank rifles, and this at the same time kept the infantry away from tanks, so the enemy's normal order of battle was upset. The infantry were wiped out separately as the tanks went ahead of them, and without infantry, the tanks were not much good on their own. They were stopped and suffered heavy losses when they pulled back. In street fighting, rifles, machine guns, submachine guns came into their own, but mention must also be made at marksmen, who fitted with their semi-automatic rifles fitted with telescopic sights, often decimated entire German detachments. So basically, okay, Hitler, basically at this time was in this kind of period of his ego would not allow him to stop the attack on Stalingrad. He wanted to take that city, because like I pointed out before, it was a vital area, Stalingrad, and the Volga it rested next to for supplies coming to the north of Russia from the south. So by taking Stalingrad and cutting off the Volga supplies was a major strategic importance. But Hitler also bought into he wanted to take Stalingrad because it carried the name of the Soviet leader. So basically the Germans put fresh impetus into a massive attack, okay? Now the Orlovsk salient was reduced, and then, on a front of only 2.5 miles, 2 German infantry divisions, a mountain division, and 2 panzer divisions hurled themselves against the great industrial complexes known as the Barricades, okay, on October 14th. Now, the 62nd Army had a major trial in holding this huge attack against the Barricade region. Shown by instance from this diary excerpt. 0800 enemy attack with tanks and infantry, battle raging over the whole front. 0930 enemy attack on tractor factory repulsed, 10 tanks on fire in the factory yard. That's how close the enemy tanks got. They were literally outside the building engaged in fighting. 10 o'clock 30 minutes later, tanks and infantry crushed the 109th Regiment at 37th Division under Zelodov, okay? 11:30 the left flank at 502nd Infantry Regiment of the 95th Division smashed in. 50 enemy tanks are rolling up on our positions. 20 minutes later, enemy has occupied stadium at tractor factory. Our units cut off inside and trying to fight their way out. 10 minutes later, commander at 117th Regiment, Guards Major Andreev, is killed. 20 minutes later, radio message from unit at 416th Regiment from hexagonal block of flats. Surrounded, have water and cartridges, will die rather than surrender. 12:30, Stuka's attack General Zelodov's headquarters in his collapsed shelter. This is how fierce the fighting was. He was in his shelter, under attack by Stukas, no communications. At 13:10 hours, 2 shelters collapse at Army headquarters. An officer trapped by legs in rubble, can't get him out, is left there to die. 15:25, Army headquarters guard now fighting in the battle. So the battle has got so close to the headquarters in the Barricade region, they are literally fighting at the outline of the headquarters itself. So 1635, General Colonel Ustinov, commanding artillery infantry regiment, asked for artillery fire on his headquarters, is surrounded by enemy with submachine guns. This kind of goes a way to explain, even in half a day, just how fierce the fighting was. So on November 11th, the German corps still fighting in the breach of the 62nd Army renewed its assaults with armour and sappers, at cost of incredible effort succeeding in isolating from rest at Russian 62nd Army the defenders of the barricades, whose courage still remained steadfast, and in overrunning the workers' quarters attached to the Red October factory. Now, the Germans did get inside the factory itself, but then the attack ground to a halt. Now, the 6th Army had worn itself out. Its infantry companies were down to 80 or even 60 men, and the 3 divisions of its Panzer Corps had only 190 tanks left, whereas normally combat effectiveness would have nearly 700. It just shows how much equipment they are losing and how battle-weary and worn the German units are becoming. Now, the situation on the other side had also worsened considerably. On West Bank at Volga, the Russian 62nd Army had only 300 to 1,000 yards behind it between its front line and the Great River Volga itself. So the river was beginning to bring down ice flows, large enough to prevent supplies or reinforcements from crossing. So these ice flows was now starting to show up in November in the Volga, which hampered Russian attempts to bring across further troops for the reinforcement of the city. Now, fact still remains, however, that by now Chuikov knew secretly that he'd won a sufficient margin of time, albeit a small one for Russia, and that within 10 days or so the enemy would have something else to think about. Of course, what he's mentioning is Operation Uranus. So basically, we quote from now Marshal Eremenko, then in command at Stalingrad front. General Eremenko wrote, "The Epic of Stalingrad brought out particularly the high and notable qualities of the Soviet people and their heroic army. Fervent patriotism, devotion to communist cause, fighting, comradeship between soldiers of all nationalities, inflexible courage and self-sacrifice, unshakable firmness in defence, Forcible bravery in attack, constant liaison and unfailing help between the front and rear areas, brotherhood between soldiers and workers in the factories and the fields, the heroic spirit which has breathed over Stalingrad has borne illustrious testimony to the power of the great Communist Party to guide and inspire our lives and to adapt itself to every circumstance, trustee as it is of the eternal ideas of Lenin. So basically, okay, Hitler by now also started to, well, not started to realise, but he also started to look at his front line. And I was going to say, little did he realise, okay, that the Russians were now reorganising. Now, while the Germans moved some troops around, steadied the flanks, the North Caucasus and Transcaucasus fronts were now being reinforced week by week on the Russian side. So that on November 15th, okay, the 22 Axis divisions, there was 1 Slovak, 6 Romanian and 15 German. So 22 divisions were opposed by almost 90 major formations, including 37 infantry divisions, 9 cavalry divisions, 8 armoured brigades and other units. The tide was about to turn on Germany's effort to secure the Caucasian oil. But even though, like I said, at the start of the 1942 campaign, Germany had enough oil to wage war for another 3 years, and thus this bleeding battle in the Don, in the Great Bend of the Don and at Stalingrad, would help bring about the destruction of the German army in the east, although it would take them a long time. It would take them a long time before they could prepare. So now, meanwhile, while the Battle of Stalingrad has been raging, okay, the Russians, in tactics they would later use at Kursk, okay, in 1943, a tactic they developed here. While the Russians were heroically defending Stalingrad in this intense butchery and street fighting, and success, failure, over and over again, the Russians held up heroically. But while this was going on in the city of Stalingrad, the Russians were organising massed armies on the flanks, and more specifically in some areas targeting the Italians, Romanians, the allies of the German armies, who, even though some of the Romanian troops had fought very well in the Crimea and at Sevastopol, and were generally good fighters. They were not on the calibre of the German divisions, even though some of those Romanian divisions, like I said, performed very well in combat. They were just not a match for the German forces, and certainly were not a match for the attack that was coming at them, because the Russians started forming armies, okay, I believe a group of 7 armies, the armies defending Stalingrad, and then north and south of Stalingrad along the river, the Russians started massing new tank and infantry and artillery formations, preparing for a massive counterattack. The battle in Stalingrad, like it would at Kursk in 1943, became simply a trap to keep the German army tied down there, exhaust the German forces before launching a massive counterattack on the flanks. And like I said, at Kursk, the Russians did the same thing. Defended the salient, allowed the Germans to burn themselves up, and then north and south from Orel and other areas launched massive wedge counterattacks with hundreds of tanks and hundreds of thousands of men. Great tactics from the Russians that they perfected. Now, okay, Hitler basically was now committed to taking the city at all costs. Now, in view of a decisive result expected from the campaign, the upcoming Operation Uranus, Stavka did not hesitate to call on half its reserve of artillery. Now, Vatutin, Eremenko and Rokossovsky got an additional 75 artillery regiments, bringing the total of artillery regiments up to 230 along this front, meaning the Russians amassed 13,500 artillery pieces and mortars. They also received 115 Katsuya rocket batteries, okay, with a total of 10,000 launchers. That is 10,000 very vicious rockets heading the German flanks ways. Now, also 2 air armies were sent to the southwest front, 1 each to the Don and the Stalingrad fronts, so that the 3 fronts had a total now of 1,000 combat aircraft, including over 600 fighter aircraft to call on. Now, the weight of this equipment was arranged in a design to batter a hole, okay, in the thinly held German fronts, especially around the flanks. The idea was to encircle Stalingrad, cut off the German 6th Army and the part of the 4th Armoured Army fighting there, and then push west to create a huge piece of ground heavily defended by a thick Soviet front line so the Germans could not break out. Now, the Germans themselves had no idea of the gigantic concentrations of Russian forces on flank of the German 6th Army. One officer said, I quote, "We did not know in what strength the Soviet troops were massing in this sector. Shortly before the attacks, there was nothing there, and suddenly we were struck by a massive blow, a blow which was to have far-reaching, even fatal consequences." So we should remember, that at OKW, General Jodl enjoying only a partial view at Eastern Front from mid-October, both in German 6th Army and the Romanian 3rd Army. There were constant concern about enemy activity in the bridgeheads he controlled and on the right bank of the Don. Especially in the areas of Kletskaya and Serafimovich. Okay, now similar signs of movement have been noticed in the sector of the 4th Panzer Army, which extended to the right flank of the German 6th Army. And General Paulus deduced that the enemy was preparing some pincer movement, which would all be the more dangerous for Germans, as the Romanians on the flanks were very poorly equipped and did not have many anti-tank weapons, which was a fatal flaw in trying to hold the coming Russian hell, basically. So he therefore strengthened left flank by bringing over the Don the armoured units at 14th Panzer Division into General Strecker's 11th Corps, but he could do no more as he had strictest orders from Hitler to hold Stalingrad at all costs. So basically, Hitler's solution. Now, Hitler expressed concern over a large Soviet counterattack that may be coming, perhaps a winter offensive starting its sector held by Allied armies on the Don and aiming towards Rostov. Now, this concern is based on strong troop movements, observed in area, and on the number of bridges the Russians have thrown over the river. So the Führer ordered each of 3 Allied armies to be stiffened with fighting divisions from the Luftwaffe. This will allow a number of divisions to be withdrawn from front and together with other units to be sent to area to build a reserve behind the Allied armies. So if they are hit by a huge onslaught, they would build a reserve with which to counterattack and try and stem the bridgehead, so to speak. So the Rostov hypothesis, however, meant the Italian 8th Army had to be strengthened. Now, this would take the first brunt of any attack in that direction. It were reinforced by a Panzer Corps under its recently appointed commander, Lieutenant Colonel Heim. Now, a few days later, Hitler, no doubt on receipt of further information, seems to have converted at the very last extreme. For Zietler's view, it is in fact on November 16th, that's D-Day -3, that a Panzer Corps received the order to move from Bogachar to another area behind the Russian Romanian 3rd Army. Obviously, they were anticipating now a massive attack on Romanian 3rd Army, so a Panzer Corps was moved into the Romanian 3rd Army's reserve area, rear area, in case they were hit. So, what was the breakdown of forces? So, basically, General von Weichs held the front from Ilista in the Kalmyk steppe to Kursk. Now the southern front had now a front line of 710 miles and was manned with only 80 divisions, 4 of which were protection of rear areas, the so-called satellite divisions. The other 76 were broken up into a number of divisions: 40 German, 9 Italian, 18 Romanian, 9 Hungarian divisions. Now, the fact remains it is true that on November 19th and 20th, the Soviet pincers bit only into 7 German and 15 Romanian divisions. So the Russians concentrated their artillery, concentrated the tanks and infantry formations on fairly small fronts. They could have attacked along a much wider front, but the Russian aim was to punch through. Now, basically, Eremenko, Vatutin and Rokossovsky were able to deploy over 1 million men, divided into 9 armies. They had a total of 66 rifle divisions, totaling just over 700,000 men. They had 5 tank corps and a mechanized corps, so they now had a noticeable numerical superiority over the Germans in the Stalingrad and Don areas. Now, in fighting vehicles, this gave the Russians nearly 900 tanks to Germany's 600, 13,500 artillery pieces and mortars to Germany's 10,000, and both with nearly 1,200 aircraft. However, the numbers given out by OKW do not tell the full story, and some German panzer divisions were not at full strength, and the Germans did not in no way have over 600 tanks facing the 900 tank onslaught. So basically the stage was set for Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack in the bend of the Don behind the city of Stalingrad. So Operation Uranus was launched on November 19th, okay, at 7:30 hours after a rocket barrage from the fearsome Katyusha rocket launchers, where there was silence. 2 minutes later, there was hell firing and raining towards the German and Romanian positions. So the artillery barrage on southwest and the Don fronts opened up on German-Romanian positions northwest of Stalingrad with about 90 artillery pieces per mile, all letting hell loose. Now, according to Russians, the density of this concentration was made less effective because of a thick fog. But be that it may, the entire telephone network of Romanian Third Army was wiped out by the shelling, showing how intense and ferocious the artillery barrage was. Now, basically, okay, the fog also helped the surprise effect, okay, because on one hand, the Russian artillery felt that they could not accurately target the bombardment, even though it was a devastating, thick bombardment. Artillery shells bang, 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 all along the front line. The Katyusha rocket launchers launching hundreds of rockets, almost like early versions of cluster bombs. I don't know if you've seen the launchers, but they've got a truck, they arch it upwards, it's filled with multiple lines, it just goes... A terrifying weapon, and those rockets come down and bombard a whole area. I mean, they are terrifying. When the Germans first encountered them, the German units went running. I mean, they are a terrifying weapon. So basically, at 8:48, okay, an hour and 20 minutes later, the Soviet barrage moved forward, and the massed infantry and tank formations flung themselves into the assault. So on the southwest front, the 5th Tank Army, okay, under General Romanenko, had the task of annihilation at Romanian defence facing the Serafimovic bridgehead, but it met such resistance that its commander had to use up in the planned breakthrough some tanks he'd planned to hold back for exploitation once he'd run a breach. So he sent his initial larger tank force in, he kept some in reserve, but the fighting was so fierce that he had to commit the rest of his tanks. Now at nightfall, 2 Soviet tank corps, protected on flanks by corps of cavalry, had punched through the breach and started pouring into the Romanian army's rear, causing mass panic. Now further to east, the Soviet 21st Army broke out of the Kletskaya bridgehead on a front of nearly 9 miles under the command of Major General Kistyakov. Now it had also to use its armoured forces to overcome resistance at Romanians. By end of 5th day, it had the same success as the 5th Tank Army. The Romanian 5th Armoured Corps, which was holding out between Kletskaya and Serafimovic, saw that it was doomed to encirclement. On the Don front, the Soviet 65th Army, attacking from Kletskaya bridgehead, where the Germans had bridged the Don, was caught at a disadvantage in a deep ravine. It also ran up against an Axis Corps which formed the left flank of the 6th Army and was counterattacked furiously by 14th Panzer Division. So it was therefore able to make only modest advances. Now the 24th Army, under Major General Galenin, okay, which had been ordered to advance along the left bank at Don, was similarly held up, okay. The 66th Army, which was to make a diversion in the Don-Volga Isthmus, stubbornly defended by an Axis Corps. Now on Axis side, okay, a Panzer Corps on standby since dawn rumbled off at 9:30 hours towards Kletskaya, where it was thought the main Russian effort was being made, without orders to engage it, without worrying about its flanks. So an hour and a half later, at 1100 hours, in light and new information, General Heim was ordered to drive towards Serafimovic, okay, which was showing now as the major point of the Russian attack. A switch from northeast to northwest, so they had to change direction. Now, in the heavy fog that was reported along the front, okay, the counter order produced confusion, okay, because of the fog. Contact were lost, and then both the 22nd Panzer Division and the Romanian 1st Armoured Division ran headfirst and blindly into the Soviet 5th Tank Army, okay, which was not the best result. The change in direction, the new orders caused panic. They weren't exactly sure which direction they were going. They went forwards and came right headfirst into Soviet 5th Tank Army, and not surprisingly, by the evening of that day, the German and Romanian divisions were in a pretty bad way and getting battered by 5th Tank Army. So the day following, November 20th, at southwest of Stalingrad, second phase of Soviet offensive opened under Colonel General Eremenko from a line of Lake Tatsa to Lake Sarpa, which basically the 64th, 57th and 51st Russian armies hit out following another massive artillery barrage and Katsuya rocket assault. So to exploit the expected breakthrough, Eremenko put a mechanized corps under command at 57th Army, while the 51st Army, had been given a mechanized corps and a cavalry corps, anticipating a breakthrough of the line to exploit any breaches. Now on the other side, all General Hoth had left at former 4th Panzer Army was the 4th Corps, but he did have Romanian 4th Army, which was about to take over command of. He thus had 7 infantry divisions, 2 of which were German, 2 Romanian cavalry divisions, and he did hold the 29th Motorised Division, the excellent unit, in reserve. So delayed by fog, the attack started at 1000 hours on the 20th of November. Now, by early afternoon, the breakthrough had come in sector at Romanian 6th Corps, whose 1st, 2nd and 18 divisions were virtually wiped out. The 29th Motorised Division tried to restore situation and scored some early success, but as the only unit capable of counterattacking amidst the general rout of the massed artillery, tank and infantry assault, it had to give ground for fear of being surrounded and destroyed. So Eremenko was not long in letting loose his cavalry and mechanised units, and on the following day, the 21st November, 2 days after the initial onslaught, at 10:30 hours, the 4th Cavalry Corps galloped into a village of I can't even pronounce, Aberganevo, station on Stalingrad Novorossisk railway line. Now, a few minutes later, Nikita Khrushchev was on the scene bringing congratulations and encouragement. So the attack had been launched, November 19th, Operation Uranus launched north of Stalingrad. Then November 20th, it was launched south of Stalingrad. I have a map in front of me with the towns on it. It's really ridiculous. Speaking Russian when you're not Russian. But basically, great sweep at dawn, on November 20th, Vatutin and Rossovsky energetically exploited the success at day before. Now, the 5th Tank Army and another tank corps, and the 3rd Guards Corps. Meanwhile, 21st Army completed the encirclement of the Romanian 5th Corps, which then turned south and fought with some tenacity, like some Romanian units, I said, had shown in the Battle of Crimea and Sevastopol. But basically, the Romanian 5th Corps was now under attack by tank and mechanised forces, totaling some 900 tanks and 2 cavalry corps, and they just could not withstand the ferocity of the attack. In fact, their headquarters, when they were taken by the Russians, they found tables laden with maps and documents, cupboards open, even keys still in the locks, teleprinters still connected, and officers' caps still hanging on their pegs. Thus was the speed of the Russian breakout. These armies raid along the Stalingrad front from the 5th Tank Army, the 21st Army, the 65th Army, the 24th Army, the 66th Army. Of course, in Stalingrad, we had the 62nd as parts at 64th Army, and then south of Stalingrad, of course, the 57th and 51st Army. Really how the Russians concentrated these forces and executed this vicious counterattack on short fronts to smash through really was effective. And it wouldn't be long until the Soviet forces linked up at Karach and Sovetskiy. So basically, the Panzer Corps resultant breakdown in radio communications was out of touch with Romanian 1st Armoured Division, but managed to break out of the encirclement. In evening of November 20th, it would have obeyed Weiss's order to retreat had it had not. And basically, the Romanian 5th Corps was ceasing to exist. Yet the Panzer Corps did finally manage to reach the German lines, although at cost at 22nd Panzer Division, which was reduced to virtually no tanks left, just mechanised vehicles. So by November 22nd, by the time November 22nd at dawn, the night before, a Soviet tank corps, on the left-hand side of the attack was within striking distance of Kalach after covering 62 miles in only 3 days. The disorder had to be exploited, The Russians realised that the attack had come and had been a major success. They'd punched through German lines, wiped out entire German and Romanian divisions en masse, performed some big encirclements, and had thus breached the lines, and the mechanised and cavalry corps and the tank armies were now exploiting that. But the Russians realised the Germans would be quick to pick up on the situation, so the Russians could not waste any time. Now, General Eremenko, had eagerly exploited his victory on November 20th, driving a cavalry corps along the railway from Kuban. He moved his 4th Mechanised Corps northwest until at 10:30 hours on November 23rd it linked up with the 4th Tank Corps from the Don Front, okay, in the village of Sovetski, some 19 miles southeast of Kalach. The two pincers link up, thus cutting off the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army. So the following day, Khrushchev came in person to congratulate Generals Volsky and Kovacheremenko and to inquire about the needs of the troops. Now, on the same day, November 24th, it saw an end to all Romanian resistance in the Don pockets that had been created by the vast Russian counterattack on the flanks. The previous evening, General Laskar, who'd just been awarded the Iron Cross with oak leaves by Hitler, had to surrender through lack of ammunition, and on 24th, the Romanian general did the same and handed over 33,000 Romanian troops into captivity. So the Russian attack came at a massive success, okay. The Russians had amassed, basically, and their attack had come ferociously and fast. And the Russians, you know, like I said, at Kursk the following year would imitate the same kind of tactics, absorbing the mass German attack while steadily building up huge forces on the flanks to counterattack. And what some people don't realise is the Russians kind of learnt this from General Erich von Manstein, because earlier in 1942, when the Russians launched a spring offensive, and Manstein, taken aback by the speed and savagery of attack and the mass numbers, absorbed the attack, gave ground, to the point that the Russians had reached the limit of their supplies. At that point, Manstein, who manoeuvred forces into position, launched a counterattack, resulting in creating huge encirclements, wiping out entire Russian corps, okay, creating huge holes in the Russian lines. And the Russians at Stalingrad and then at Kursk would kind of replicate these tactics. So basically, this left the German army basically in a tight position. You know, they needed, estimated, for their 250,000 men, 8,000 horses, 1,800 artillery pieces, and nearly 10,000 vehicles. They needed, 700 tons a day. Now, Hermann Göring, initially when German generals pressed Hitler to order the 6th Army to break out from Stalingrad and link up under Manstein's planned counterattack, Hitler, assured by Göring that the Luftwaffe would be able to keep them supplied by the air, ordered them to hold the city at any cost. Now, after linking up at Kalach and going from Kalach down to Sovietsky, where the link-up happened, the Russians now started to push west. So basically, the encirclement of German 6th Army, Russian forces now started to push in on the 6th Army's surroundings, approaching Stalingrad from the west, while Russian forces pushed west to create a huge set of ground between the trapped German 6th Army and the German front line, to basically keep it locked in a pocket dozens of miles behind enemy lines, so to speak. So basically, they needed 500 tons a day. Now, initially, the Germans in Stalingrad would receive 91 tons a day. Now, the loss, basically, of all many planes to the Soviet offensives, because now when the Germans were trying to supply Stalingrad, they came under attack by massed Russian fighter aircraft, and German supply columns were hit pretty badly as well, trying to get into the salient. So with the Russian attack, they could get nothing in from the outside, and the Luftwaffe were already failing. So it was only a matter of time, before the Germans would actually, run out of food, basically. So a pocket, measuring 37 miles between Stalingrad and western perimeter, was made, and 25 miles from north to south. So this pocket, a huge slay of land, including Stalingrad and the approach to Stalingrad. There was now trapped nearly 250,000 German troops. Now, a day after breakthrough at Lake Sata, one corps had come under 6th Army command as it retreated across Don, and the surprise attack at Kalach had taken it, with it the Romanian 1st Cavalry Division. So Paulus, in the pocket had 15 infantry divisions, 3 motorized divisions, and 3 panzer divisions, with 1 division of cavalry, a total of 278,000 men. But it must also be noted that in these divisions, many of them, the panzer divisions, were now completely eviscerated and had very little tanks. Even the motorized divisions were short on equipment, short on fuel for the vehicles, short on vehicles, and the infantry divisions were now operating at about 30 to 40% strength due to the heavy casualties and the lack of availability of reinforcing them. So the German 6th Army is now cut off. The Russian counterattack, like I said, was vast. And basically, on December 16th, the Soviets would launch Operation Saturn, okay, a pincer movement, to destroy the Italian 8th Army, the Romanian 3rd Army, and drive all the way to Rostov. But I will go through the further events of the Eastern Front 1943. We will cover through to the thaw period. On the Eastern Front, basically every March is generally a thaw period, as the winter snows melt, and vehicles are completely immovable for the most part. So we will cover the conclusion of World War II, Eastern Front 1942, in part 4, which is coming next. But the Battle of Stalingrad, what an intense battle for months, and what heroism shown, not only on the Soviet side, but on the German side too. I'm out for now.